Halo teman-teman, sekarang saya Rainer di StartUp. Sekarang kita bersama dengan Korean Morris di sini. Oke, saya akan beri Korean Morris penjelasan sedikit. Okay, Korean Morris, can you tell us a little bit about yourself right now?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Corian Morris. I currently do business development at Zulily, but my background is in the startup space. So really for as long as I can remember, I've been an entrepreneur. I've been interested in startups. So, in high school, I did a small training business where I trained different people on how to improve their athletic abilities.
Okay.
And so even before I knew what entrepreneurship was, I think I was kind of being
Since
an
high
entrepreneur.
school.
Yeah, really since high school. But I would say, I really kind of got my feet wet my freshman year of college. Yeah, I was a student athlete, and I bought a car as a freshman, kind of customized the car a little bit. And one day I was driving down the road and saw another guy with a similar car. And for whatever reason, we pulled over on the side of the road and started talking. And his name was Bill. And he was actually in the process of founding his first company called C3 Motorsports. And,
C3 Motorsports.
Yeah, and they specialize in doing automotive customization for the LX platform of vehicles. So really, this was in 2006. So this was the Dodge Charger, the Chrysler 300, and Dodge Magnum. And I taught myself in high school how to do graphic design, Photoshop, web development, different things like that. And so he was getting ready to start this business, and he needed somebody to come alongside and help with their marketing, some e-commerce. And so really as a freshman in college, I joined his team as an intern initially to really kind of help them develop a digital presence, develop the e-commerce strategy and all of that. And really ultimately ended up becoming a full-time employee for them, while I was in school over the next few years. And that really piqued my interest eventually I'd like to open up my own business. And so, in college, in my junior year, I started doing some kind of side things, some kind of side projects. So I did some custom lighting for people. I did, some custom painting, different things like that.
Okay. But for automotive itself, right?
Yeah, for automotive stuff, really just out of my garage.
Okay.
And with the goal of eventually kind of building a portfolio and being able to launch my own business. So in 2011, I finished my undergraduate at University of Arizona. I moved back up to Seattle, and I started my first business, Masonry Automotive Group.
Okay, interesting there. So it started out from your hobby itself, and it grew out into the automotive side of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, when I was in Arizona and I saw that you could do stuff with cars and get paid for it, that kind of became the dream scenario of, working with something. I love cars kind of naturally. And so doing something where I could do both of them. And so really the thought process in founding Masonry was, I was really I'm kind of a tech guy. So I really like technology and gadgets and different things like that. And so I wanted to marry kind of my passion of technology and cars. And so I founded that shop really focusing on high-end electronic integration. And so this is around 2011. And what you started to see happen in the market was, manufacturers, let's say Lexus or Mercedes, they were making it increasingly difficult to integrate new stereo systems into cars, for example. Okay. Historically, you might have a doubled-in radio. You could pull that out and put a new one in. Now you can't do that anymore. And so what I was doing is specializing in really doing kind of high-end installs. And because I didn't have a lot of funding at that time, I really kind of coined this term of, highly personalized service. So I knew that I couldn't compete with, Best Buy or Car Toys or any of those places. And so really what I did instead is I told customers, hey, when you bring your car into my shop, I'm only working on your car. I'm not working on anybody else's car. So you get 100% of my attention. You're going to get really, just the best service you can get, but I'm going to charge you a lot in exchange for that. But ultimately, I think that served us, really well.
How long did it last, the Masonry Group?
Yeah, so we lasted, we ran, really, I would say, started in my garage in Arizona, probably around 2009.
Okay. And you moved it to Seattle as well?
I moved it to Seattle. Really, the focus when I was in Arizona was, it was kind of a side thing. So really, it's just bring some extra money in to kind of develop a portfolio. I ran the business through 2015, full time. So, eventually, so I did, these kind of high-end electronics. Eventually, I had a customer come in, Dave, and, he initially reached out to me to have some custom lights done. And, I did the lights. He's really happy. And then he said, hey, do you know somebody that can do a stereo for me? And actually, at that point in time, I didn't do stereos yet, but I wanted the money. And so I said, sure, I'll do a stereo for you.
So you learned from that as well?
Yeah. And so I did the stereo for him. And he kept coming up with more and more things for me to do. And so eventually I asked him, I said, hey, Dave, your car's been in my shop for 6 months. It seems like you don't want it to leave. Why? And really just kind of dug into that with him. And what I discovered was, he had spent close to $100,000 on his car at another shop. And he felt like that shop didn't prioritize his car in the way that they should have. And so what he really appreciated about what we did for him is, we were the only people, we were only focusing on his car. And that gave me some insight into a pivot that we had ultimately ended up doing to where, instead of just doing really high-end electronics, what I did instead is I focused on really personalized service for customers and doing kind of comprehensive builds. So ultimately, we ended up finishing Dave's car and doing a lot of different things that we wouldn't have traditionally done and really position the business into doing anything that you could imagine. So let's say, I'll give you an example. I had a customer who was actually a friend of mine from undergraduate. He lived in the Middle East, so in the UAE.
Okay.
And he reached out and said, hey, I want you to build me a Mustang. And so we went out, we found him a 1965 Ford Fastback Mustang from Arizona. We shipped it, up to Seattle, completely tore the car apart, and spent quite a lot of money designing it all the way from the ground up and really building him kind of his dream vehicle. And then we shipped that to the Middle East.
To the Middle East, you shipped that to the Middle East.
Correct. Yes.
Are there any problem with the regulation and stuff?
No. So we just took that into consideration as we were building the car. So there's certain things that you can and cannot do as far as certain motors, different things like that, and certain emissions kind of regulations that you have to do. But outside of that, no. Yeah.
So you mentioned that from being a high end like garage thing, and you moved to more personalized one.
Yes.
Doesn't it cause like problems with like scalability as well? Like how you can scale the business itself?
Yeah, so I would say
from the story itself, I see that mostly you are the one that actually do the hard work. And
so ultimately what ended up happening, so it started off where I was doing a lot of the work.
Gotcha.
And when we started to transition into, I would say we were still very high end, so we were very expensive. And that was kind of the transaction of, if we're only focusing on your car, you're going to get all of our attention, but you have to pay us, to account for that. And, but ultimately what ended up happening is, once we transitioned out of just doing high-end electronics, I no longer had the skill set to do all the work. And so actually what I did is I created kind of a distributed network of other experts. So I had an upholstery guy. I had somebody that would do performance work for us. I had a painter. So I had a team of probably about 8 different people. That allowed me, the customer would only interface with me. So the experience was as if I had a shop that had staff of 25 people. But in reality, it was just me. And then I would kind of subcontract out the different other components. And so that allowed us to scale up more effectively and keep costs relatively low and to provide the best service. So from the perspective of a business owner, let's say I have an upholstery guy, he might want $100,000 a year to do his work. And so that's, $100,000 of extra expenses a year that I have to take on. And I have to justify that somehow. By using him as a contractor instead, I'm able to get that same level of quality. And maybe I give him $30,000 a year through our projects, but then he can work with other people for the other jobs he wants.
So the flexibility itself.
Exactly. So that allowed us to really scale up our service offerings, still continue to provide at a very high level, but maintain kind of our cost structure without making it, get too high and really having the flexibility. So, I was able to bring people on as I needed them, and so everybody kind of won.
How did you go through all these thought processes as well? Because do you learn this through school, or do you say it's mostly from your experience itself?
Yeah. So I studied business economics in undergraduate, and so I would say I'm kind of inherently an analytical person, and I'm gonna spend time thinking about how can we improve processes and different things like that. But really, I would say it was just learning as I went. So. School, undergraduate was great. I learned a lot, but ultimately kind of learning by doing, learning over time. So, for example, this customer, Dave, he initially, he had a very kind of clearly defined scope of what he wanted us to provide for him. But, something I would say that's very entrepreneurial is learning from your customers, asking questions and letting that guide your decision making. And so by doing that, we discovered, hey, there's a whole new business opportunity here that we hadn't realized before. And so we were able to pivot and do something. And I would say they talk about that in school, but I think the ability to recognize that is something you learn from doing it.
From doing it.
Yeah. But there was definitely some, there's some skills that I developed in school. But I would say a lot of it really is just kind of getting out there. And, yeah, exactly.
But maybe school just give like the perspective itself, like the structure itself. Like
I would say the structure, the frameworks, how do I think about different things? How do I approach different things? And I just went to graduate school here at UW. I just finished actually this year.
Yeah, I saw that as well.
Yes, yeah. And so, I would say graduate school, there was many more things that are really tangible, kind of tactical things that I could apply directly to my daily life, especially in the startup space, whether it's, building financial models, selling effectively. And so not just, I think there's a very kind of interpersonal aspect of how do you sell, how do you pitch things, but also, kind of tactically, there's things that you need to make sure you touch on, different things like that. And so,
Interesting one. Okay. So what happened from there to like now?
Sure. Yeah. So,
what does it on before?
Absolutely. So I continued to run, masonry. It went really well. And then I was actually diagnosed with cancer. And so, I had started to get really sick, and I went through kind of the whole process of becoming diagnosed. And ultimately, I was kind of faced with a decision. At that point, I think I was about 25 years old. 25 years and, I had to make the decision, do I want to continue to try to run this business and go through chemotherapy and radiation, or do I want to, focus on getting healthy? And, I wanted to continue to run the business, but I spoke with my family, and they really urged me to focus on your health. Your health is something you have once. And so that's actually why I closed the business down, was to go through chemotherapy, go through radiation, and really focus on getting healthy again. Gotcha. And so I went through that for about a year, and I started to kind of evaluate next steps. I still wanted something that was very kind of entrepreneurial in spirit, but I wanted something with a bit more structure. And so I didn't necessarily want to just found my own business, just because when you bootstrap a business, and especially right out of college where you don't have resources and different things like that, it's challenging. It can be really stressful. And so I started looking at different opportunities, and I came across an opportunity with a company called Rain Globes. And Rain Globes is the equivalent to a snow globe, but it rains on the inside. And so
it rains on the inside.
It does, yeah.
So it's not a snow globe.
Yeah, so it's a gift and a kind of souvenir item.
Okay.
And you flip it upside down, you sit it down on a table, and it has like a really cool rain effect, and it rains over a diorama or cool
I don't think I ever saw that once before.
Yeah, so they're pretty neat. And so this was an idea that was created by three co-founders, three guys that went to high school together.
Okay.
All really successful entrepreneurs. They have a pretty robust intellectual property portfolio, and so they had developed intellectual property, made sure that all the patents and everything that were issued, and they had commercialized the company up to a certain level. And their goal was to bring somebody on board that could focus on scaling that business up. And so for me, it was a really unique opportunity to come alongside some really seasoned guys that have done some really great stuff. Been a part of IPOs and different things like that. Learn from them.
How was it? How was the IPO and stuff?
It was great, for them. One of them was a part of a company called The Globe that IPO'd and did pretty well. And so, so it was a great opportunity for me to learn alongside these guys. One of them is an angel investor. The other one's been a part of, has launched several companies that have been acquired. And so, it afforded me the flexibility of learning something that's still very entrepreneurial, but also like a salary, and be able to afford health insurance, different things like that. And so I joined that team in January of 2016. 2016. Yeah. And came in, learned the company. Within the first year, they made me a partner in the company. So I was actually given some equity. And really we spent, the better part of the last 3 years kind of just scaling the company. So, I would say when I joined, we had, about 9 different designs. Now the company has closer to 20 designs, and we've increased our footprint significantly. So, we broke onto the Eastern Seaboard, so the product are available in New York. We we're in Bartell Drugs up here in Seattle. And so, yeah, it's really become a pretty cool product. And we've transitioned. Initially, we really focused on geographic locations. So we had a Seattle design. We had a Ketchikan, Alaska. Design. Yeah, New York. And something that we're really incredibly excited about. We did about a year ago is we started to do more generic designs. And so a generic design might be, rubber ducky. It might be kind of a funny fishing person design. It might be, a rainbow. And the thought process behind those is, something that we discovered when we were growing the company is it was difficult to break into retail in certain markets like New York if you only had a single design. What we found in speaking with customers is, sure, we like this design, but we want to be able to sell 5 or 6 different products. And so really to address that, we create these generic designs that you could sell everywhere. And there's also a very seasonal element to the business. And so to combat that, we came out with more generic designs that could sell, really any time.
Would you say the season product are more result in more sales compared to the geographic one, or not really?
Yeah, so I would say that the generic designs are still relatively new. So the team is really still collecting data on what the sales cycle kind of looks like for that. For us historically, a bulk of our business, the holiday season, so really the fourth quarter of every year, and then the summer. So if you think about, a geographic design like Seattle, when do the most tourists come to Seattle? It's during the summer when it's nice. And so that's really where the geographic designs, I think, do incredibly well. But if you think about, we have a rubber ducky with a rainbow. That's something that with an umbrella. That's something that can be positioned as a birthday gift, as a baby shower gift, as a, really as anything. So that's something that really can sell any time of year. And so our expectation is that, we would see revenue increase
but more stable.
Exactly, off-peak times relative to the geographic locations. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so I've provided some questions as well.
Yes.
So let's go through this. So, what will you think is like your biggest mistake when you start the masonry group itself?
Yeah.
And if you think something you can change as well.
Sure. So my greatest mistake. I would actually say, so it's not necessarily right when I started. I would say is a few months after we opened our physical location. And I had some customers that reached out to me to do some custom lighting for their cars. And they were all, really anxious, really excited about it. I gave them a pretty good deal. And I had a pretty clearly defined timeline of how I like to do things. But they said, hey, we'll pay you in advance to do this work. If you can fit us all in on this time. And I think I prioritized making that money then and there instead of sticking to kind of the policies that I had outlined. And so it turned a situation into kind of a headache and a pretty stressful one because, you create policies and guidelines and things like that for a reason. And when I failed to adhere to those, it opened me up to kind of a stressful situation. And so that ended up being, a really tough situation. And then I would say kind of what goes alongside that is really controlling expectations, so I think especially when you're a small business and you're trying to get going, you have a desire to, really overpromise and you want to close the sale. I can give you everything. I can give you the world. And what I've since found is it's much better for us to be measured in what we're saying we can do, and really to underpromise and overdeliver and let that kind of drive the customer experience. And so those are things that I just had to learn. I was young. I didn't know that yet. So there's things, I had to learn.
How old were you when you started the group again?
So I was 25. But I would say, sorry. I was 22. About
25
22.
was the one
25
when you ended.
Yeah, it was about when I ended. So, so I would say, the other one is make sure to get everything in writing. Like a contract, I think is important. Clearly define the timeline, customer expectations. Because I think what happens a lot of time with customers is we're just not controlling expectations. So they expect something either in a certain time or a certain price or whatever that might be. And which is, again, open ourselves up for a stressful situation when we don't control those types of things.
So you had experiences starting a company as well. And if, for example, someone like me, I want to start a company myself,
Yes.
would you say marketing, finance, or like other aspect of the business? Which one do you think is the most important part of it?
I would say, right, I guess this could kind of fall into the bucket of marketing. Knowing your customer,
Knowing your
I think is probably the most important thing that you can do. Really, if you're going to be a successful entrepreneur, I think a lot of the time we go and we have a hypothesis, we have an idea, we think, hey, this would be a really great product, and that's one data point. But ultimately, I think the success of a project or whatever we're working on is going to be determined by customers' acceptance of it, right? And so I think listening to customer feedback, like you can go in there with a hypothesis and say, this is what I think is going to work, and you start doing it, but really be receptive to feedback that you're hearing from customers. And if they're telling you something, listen in on it. I think really kind of try to dig deep and understand what they're getting at, because there can be insight. And so I think a prime example of that is, we started off just doing high-end electronics. That was our hypothesis, that would be successful, and it was up to a certain level. But I think listening to the customer and determine and understanding, oh, he's frustrated because these guys aren't focusing on him. Oh, he's frustrated because he's an individual that has a day job, and right now he's managing, somebody doing electronics here, somebody doing my upholstery here, somebody doing my paint here. That's a tough situation for him. And so by really actively listening, I was able to turn, well, I can take all that on and be compensated for it and carve out a place in the marketplace for myself that nobody else had at that time. And so I would say, the finance, the accounting, kind of the marketing, all of that stuff you can figure out, right? I think, but the ability to really listen to customers will never, lead you wrong.
Would you say that's a skill set or more sort of like talent? Is it something you hone?
I think it's a skill set. I think it really boils down to just active listening. Okay. I think sure there are some people that kind of inherently have that ability, but I think any person that's going to really be successful in business, that's something that they do, and they do a lot of. Because ultimately, I think you let your customers drive your decision making. You make your decisions because this is what the customer wants, is what is best for the customer, and so on and so forth.
So most of the audience here will be like college students.
Okay.
Around my age as well.
Great.
I'm assuming. And so a lot of us actually take like classes, like business classes and entrepreneurship classes as well. And most of us wonder, is it better for us to just directly go and start a business, or would you say it's better for us to go to the workforce first and gain some experience?
Sure. Yeah.
And what's your take on that?
I don't think there's any right or wrong way. I think it depends on the person. So, I guess to take a step back. So I was just in grad school. Everything that I was learning in grad school, I thought was much more impactful because I was running a business at the same time. And so you learn something, and you're not just learning something kind of in the abstract, you're thinking about it. How am I going to apply this today? And so I think whenever you can think about how to apply your learnings immediately in a meaningful way is always going to be incredibly valuable. I think, so me personally, I worked for a place in college, but really once I graduated college, I went directly into my own business. And there's some lessons that are incredibly valuable from that. I think a lot of the fundamental skills that you need to develop, and even just, discipline and, different things like that, you develop through that process. But I would say the other side of that coin is that you're very under-resourced, right? So I don't know if you've read, there's a book called Founder's Dilemmas. So it's a great book. I'd really recommend it.
Founder's Dilemma?
Yes. And what it talks about is what are all the dilemmas or the trade-offs that we, when we're founding a business, have. And so, one of those is timing, right? So let's say you finish your undergraduate and you go work at Amazon and you're making $100K a year. You can spend the next 5 years saving money. You can spend the next 5 years developing an understanding of how this business works at scale, develop insight, develop a network. And those are all things that when you go and launch your own business are going to be that much more valuable to you. You have a network if you're looking for investors. You have money to live off of to fund your venture for a few years. You have an understanding of how to do something at scale, right? And so those are all things that can prove to be incredibly valuable. Whereas if you found that business right out of undergraduate, you don't have those resources. So maybe you can't necessarily build the company in the right way, or the way that you would have in an ideal scenario, because you don't have the resources, different things like that. So really, ultimately, it's trade-offs. I think you can be successful doing either or. For me, I've recently transitioned into a more corporate environment to be able to get maybe some more of those resources to continue to develop my network and different things like that. So it's ultimately, I think it depends. It depends on the person.
Depends on the person.
Yeah.
How would you differentiate the corporate environment and like the startup entrepreneur environment? Starting your own business.
Yeah. So I would say, like, if there's one thing about the startup space, it's that your success is ultimately dependent on you, right? So it's discipline. It's getting up every day. There's nobody calling you telling you, hey, you've got to be at work at 9. And so you have to. The onus is really on you to take ownership and say, I'm going to drive this forward. And so I would say it requires discipline. It requires vision. For this is what I want to build, right? Whereas a lot of corporate environments don't so much. A lot of people, and ultimately, I think that's why there's entrepreneurs. There's people that, even myself, I don't function well not having something I'm really aggressively driving towards. I'm a very imaginative person, and so I always like to think about, what can I do this? I like to build things, right? And so I think there are corporate environments where you can leverage similar skill sets, so problem solving is something you do a ton of in startups, and some corporations you do, some you don't. I think the answer is it depends more often than not. But I would say, there's definitely value. I mean, there's a lot of people that are, doing great things like Amazon and these various companies, or that have startups now that started their careers in a corporate environment. So you can certainly do it either way.
Would you say it's much harder to actually balance your life when you're a startup owner?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that goes back to the fact that it's on you, right? So, if there's one single skill that I could say, that startups really helped me develop, it's the understanding and the ability to just get things done. In the startup space, there's a lot of times where you work in ambiguity. Things aren't clearly defined. You're learning as you go. You have to just figure it out. I would say, when you're in a startup, especially a smaller startup, you tend to be much more of a generalist. And so you maybe have a wide breadth of skills, but your expertise in each of those maybe isn't the deepest, because you just have to know how to do everything. And so I think a prime example of that is, with running Wranglos for the last several years. I managed, brick and mortar retail where we had, several hundred locations. I managed, product design and development. I managed all of e-commerce, and so I had to have knowledge and insight in kind of each of those. When you go into a corporate environment, you'll have one of those that you need to do. Exactly. And so some people don't like that, some people do, some people don't. It just really depends on the person.
Are there any preference for you? Which one do you prefer more?
So I definitely prefer kind of it's not exclusive to a startup environment, but something that's much more multidisciplinary or more of a generalist type of thing. Because, there's times when I spent time designing ads for our products. And then the next day I'm running, an analysis in Excel. And so I appreciate the ability to use, the left and right side of my brain. I think that makes you more well-rounded. I think it forces you to think about and look at problems from multiple perspectives. So I certainly, I would say I'm partial to doing things that are, not as mundane, not the same task every day.
So you mentioned to me that you had a chemotherapy that went through.
Yes.
And how is it going so far?
Yeah. So, I've been in remission now for 4 years, almost 4 years. And so, the cancer has been clear. It's usually the 5-year mark is kind of when everything's good. You shouldn't have any further issues. So as much as I know, it's gone pretty well so far. It was tough at the time to go through it, but
do you think that by itself changed you as a person? Was there anything that changed from you?
Yeah, I would say Well, so it's interesting. So my older brother actually had cancer too.
Okay.
And I had Hodgkin's lymphoma. He had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and so very similar cancers. He was 16 years old when his was caught, and so I would say he was at like such a young age that it really kind of transformed him, because at 15, 16 years old, you're really developing who you're going to be. I would say, we're always constantly evolving and changing, but at like 24, 25, 26, we kind of are who we are to a degree. And so I would say, I wouldn't say that there was a major shift in like who I was as a person. I would say there was a significant takeaway, which was empathy, and really that can help in business, honestly, a lot, but just empathy in life. And what I mean by that is, I was, it's 25 years old, diagnosed with cancer. But I had family and friends that all came alongside me and really helped out and supported me. I'm a high school track and field coach as well. And like that, their booster club gave me money to help pay for medical bills and stuff like that. And so I was so well supported, and something that really stuck out to me is I remember in some of my chemotherapy sessions, my mom would come to one, my fiance would come to another, her grandma would come to another. There's always somebody to take me. And you sit in this big room and you see all these other people, and they don't have anybody there to help them. They don't have anybody there to just talk to them or be there with them. And so you really do develop like this sense of like, yeah, my situation's bad, but that person's is way worse, And so I would say it's very humbling, but it's also you just develop a greater sense of empathy for what other people are going through. And that's not something that I think that's something you have to constantly kind of remind yourself of. Like,
Empathy.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that we've been in certain situations. And I was just speaking with somebody about this over the weekend that, he had pancreatic cancer. And so you see somebody, it's like, oh yeah, I remember what that's like, And so, yeah, I would say that was my greatest kind of takeaway.
And you mentioned that it's a strength as well in business, which is quite controversial currently. Like some people say that the strength in business is more so like the alpha male itself.
Yeah,
but there's a polar opposite thought as well, that it's empathy. And what's your take on that? Why could you say that empathy is a strength itself in business?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, if we're going back to listening to your customers, right? So I think there's a difference between listening and active listening, right? I think listening with active listening really is listening with intent to really understand. And I think you can sympathize with somebody, or you can feel sorry for them, and you can kind of understand. But empathize really is putting yourself in their shoes, right? And so, let's say a customer has a pain point. When you empathize, you feel that pain point. You make that pain point your own, and that allows you to, I think, more effectively look at things from their perspective, more effectively understand, okay, what solution would I really want if I'm this person? And so it's less about, how can I just make a buck or make $1 off of somebody? But it's really about creating a solution that really addresses that person's pain point. And it's my belief that that's how you build a business, a really successful, and not just a successful business, but a sustainable business, right? A business that, think about from the perspective of the customer, that they use your product, or they use your service, and they're like, man, this is exactly what I would have made for myself. This is exactly what I want. They're going to go and share that with other people, right? So it's much less about it just being kind of a transaction, in exchange of money for a product, and it's more about, man, this brand intimately knows me, or I identify with this, and now they want to share that with their friends and their family. And I think that's how you start to build equity in a brand, and you build something that's much more sustainable.
Interesting point of view. And do you have any tips for us young people as well?
Yeah.
The one that's starting out, that's still figuring out life as well.
Yeah. So I turned 31 a few months ago, and I would say right around my 30th birthday, one of the greatest things that I realized is that there's no rush, So I think when I was in high school, I was like, man, okay, by 30 years old, I'll be rich and I'll have this and I'll do that. And I think those things are great. But what I've come to learn is that everything kind of happens in its own time. And so, to give you an example, so, I had my business. and I was growing and it was going well. And then I got sick. And so I was essentially forced to close the business. And if your goal is by 27 to be able to buy a car, like buy a Lamborghini or buy a house or whatever it is, that life event has completely thrown you off track, right? And but if your goal is to build something that's sustainable and to focus on kind of the process, then you use that as an opportunity to learn and improve yourself and say, okay, what lessons? So like, I believe that I'm a better businessman today than I was or I would have been without going through that experience, right? And so you're going to have bumps on the road. You'll have to learn things over time, accepting that that's a part of the process, that's actually going to ultimately make you a better person. And just kind of taking it one step at a time. So it's not a super clear or really well communicated point of advice, but it's
an interesting point of advice.
Yeah. I think things happen kind of in their time,
Gotcha.
Right? I've started to believe that kind of we are where we're supposed to be when we're supposed to be there, right? And things come along at the right time. And so again, if I wouldn't have closed that business, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to work with the co-founders and the partners I've had for the last 4 years, right? And to build those relationships and to work with those people and learn as much as I did, and work in a larger startup that had raised capital and different things like that, and take all of that, and so everything I think happens for a reason. Yeah, and I think as long as we have, like, maybe it's your North Star, right? Maybe it's, I know that I'm working towards this thing, even if it doesn't happen in the way you envisioned it or in the time that you envisioned it. If you're continuing to work on it, you're going to get there, and you'll probably get there in a much more fulfilling way. I think there's like a meme that shows what success looks like, and people think it's like a dot here and a dot here, and it's a straight line. And,
I saw that before.
Yeah, and in reality, it's all this.
It's just all Jim Lee there.
That's where you develop character. That's where you develop relationships. You develop friends. You learn, and that is what it looks like. But I think it's so much more worth it that way.
Yeah. You remind me of a speech that Steve Jobs gave once about like how when you go through life, you don't really understand how the dots plays out. But when you look back, you just see everything got connected. Yeah,
and I 100% believe that that's because if you have your North Star, right? If you have this thing that you're working towards, even if you get way off track and you're over there, even if you have cancer, even if you lose everything, and no matter what it is, you're still working in that general direction, you're going to get there. I was an athlete in high school and college, and there's a quote: "Inch by inch, it's a cinch. Yard by yard, it's hard." And so, like, when we're thinking about making these huge jumps in our lives, it's difficult to do that. But when we're just focused on putting the next foot in front of the other, how am I better today? What small goal am I accomplishing today? You look back, and before you know it, you've covered so much ground, and you've built like a really cool, compelling story for yourself.
So, what's your next step after this?
Yeah, so
I understand that you just get a job in.
Yeah, so one of our big goals with Rain Globes was to scale the company up to a certain level. In manufacturing, it's really expensive. It can be challenging, and so our goal was to eventually hand the company off. And so on October 1st, we signed an exclusive licensing deal with a company called Ace USA, and so they've actually taken over the bulk of our business. And so that was really just a great time for me to transition. So I've transitioned into a role with a local tech company doing business development. And so for me, it's a really great opportunity to get more experience working in kind of a more traditional corporate environment. But this is an organization that is currently undergoing some changes. And something that's really important to me is to go where I can make an impact and go where I can help things change. And so even though this is a huge corporation, it's a very kind of entrepreneurial time. It's a time of transition, a time of change. And so I'm excited to be a part of that. And then really it's thinking about how I can kind of help and inspire. That's why I joined you, is have more discussions, share. Yeah, absolutely. Share what I've learned. I think it helps me and hopefully helps other people as well. And one day, I'll launch, another venture. I think one day I'd love to.
Are there any set point in time, like, when I'm this age, I want to launch something?
I think right now, I'm an entrepreneur, at heart. And so even when I'm in an organization, I'm always going to be thinking about ideas. I'm always going to identify, this is a problem. Like, can I solve it? And I have a checklist of, am I the person to solve it? Is this the right time to solve it? Do I have the resources to solve it? All of those types of things. And so I would say there's not a predefined timeline, but, knowing myself, I'm sure I'll have something here sooner rather than later. And, and eventually I'd love to, to invest in businesses and, I do some consulting and different things like that. So I help other startups, and
business development as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how do you mentioned that you always get this constant idea as well. And how do you think you get these ideas? Because for me, I know that I want to start business, but I'm still confused on like what business to start by itself.
Yeah, I would say I look at it kind of twofold. So, I would say on one hand, I'm looking at like what are my passions, what I'm interested in, and how can I monetize things like that. And so, like I said, I used to do a lot of web design, web development, and branding work and stuff like that. And so that was an opportunity to help out businesses, but also help to create kind of a brand and a narrative around that brand early stage. And so those are more like kind of side hustle things that I've done in the past. But I think being curious is something that's really important. And what I mean by that is seeing things, how they work and asking why. And for me, because I'm an analytical person, after I ask why is this like that? The next question is, can we make it better? Right. And so that kind of begins the thought process of like, okay, could this turn into something here? And so I think a prime example of that is, I grew up with a single mother, and she always struggled with finding a really trustworthy mechanic. And, because I'm a car guy, people always have communicated to me that, oh man, I wish I could find a good mechanic. And so I really started kind of dive into it. And the data shows that most people don't like going to mechanics. They don't like dealerships. They feel like it's kind of
why is that?
I'm sorry?
Why is that?
Yeah, it's a few different reasons. So if you're looking at like dealerships as a whole, if you look at a dealership service department, they have two kind of primary ways to drive revenue, right? So they either need to bring more people in the door, right? So they need to increase kind of the number of people that are coming in. That's difficult to do because there's a lot of dealerships, or you need to charge more money per person, right? And there's kind of an information dissymmetry between what I know as the owner of a dealership or as a service person and what you may know as the owner of the car, right? So let's say you bring your car into me and you say, the steering wheel is vibrating. Me as the owner of the dealership or the service person knows that, okay, well, they might need tire rotation, they might need to balance, they might need to replace their tires, they might need to swap out their brake rotors, right? So I have a pretty clearly defined list of potential issues that it can be. You don't know that, right? So I could, let's say it's, the tires need to be balanced. That should only cost $50 or less. You not knowing that and me needing to increase revenue, I could say, hey, we need to swap out your brake rotors instead. You don't know any better. And instead of charging you $50, I charge you $500. Right?
Does it happen a lot in?
It does. It's actually pretty common because, from a service perspective, they need to drive revenue. They need to bring more money in so that they're compensated a lot of the time based off of performance, right? And so it actually does happen. So there's kind of this inherent distrust that a lot of people have with going to these places, right? And so does it need to be like that? It doesn't need to, in my opinion, it doesn't need to be like that, right? And so actually when I was here at school, that's what I spent, my entire program really focusing on was a startup that, really kind of takes the pain out of automotive service, something that a lot of people dread going to have their car serviced or maintained. And our goal is, again, being empathetic. How can we create a service that you enjoy using or that, you use and you feel really good about?
That's why empathy is really
exactly
important.
Yeah. And again, like that was developed from an insight that I had from my mom. Again,
from your mom.
Yeah. And so that's where the empathy comes from is what I want my mom to be taken advantage of. I want to build this.
So when you actually serve a customer, you were thinking about you're serving your mom as well.
Absolutely.
Thinking what if that person is your mom?
Yep. Exactly. And I mean, that's just me personally. Obviously,
I
different
think that's a
people.
really powerful way to see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's who's somebody that's impactful. I think it makes it a little bit more real, right? Like you can have customer personas, and you can look at we've got this person that does X, Y, and Z. But I think when you can relate it to somebody that you know, then I think you're going to work a little bit harder and drive a little bit more aggressively towards really trying to solve that problem for them.
Gotcha.
Yeah.